Birmingham is growing, and it's growing in so many ways. Over the last 5 years, the city economy has grown by almost 20%, to the fact that it's now worth £25 billion a year. We now get 33.5 million people visiting the city every year. And our population is growing. A population that's famously young, where 52% of the population are under the age of 35. And we have a big city plan, a plan to grow even more, a plan to be one of the best cities in the world by 2030. And when you add all these things together, the money starts flooding in. £1 billion is the budget for the redevelopment of the wholesale markets into what's to become Smithfield. That's £1,000 million for one development. And these are always the big numbers we get pushed around, the headlines that we get told about. But we never get any insight from any of this data, because you don't get insight from data. You only get the insights when you start to question it, to look at what that context is, and to understand where that data is coming from and who's telling you what that data is. Because in Birmingham, amongst this great big city plan, we've still got some issues. We're a city with the second highest level of unemployment across all core cities, a situation that's even worse for our famous young population. We're a city where 50% of the under-17s live in neighbourhoods which are regarded as some of the most deprived areas in the country. And we're still a city where 1 in 3 children grow up in poverty. But it's not just an economic deficit we have, it's a health deficit too. We're a city where if you're born in Shard End, your life expectancy is a whole decade shorter than somebody else born in Sutton Coldfield. And we have a democratic deficit too. A recent study by the City Council showed that only 7% of residents felt they had any involvement in local decision-making. And yet we're the city of Cadbury, one of the companies that radically changed what it was like to be an employer, who physically built communities for their workers to allow them to thrive and to really consider their health and well-being. We're a city of Austin, and later the Rover Group, who built housing and physical communities so that their employees knew that having a job was more than just going to work. But these great institutions leave legacies too. The legacy of looking for our big companies to do, looking for the big companies to be the ones that provide the answers. Becoming consumers not just of their products, but consumers of their way of life too. And we're a product of our other institutions too. Herbert Manzoni, one of Birmingham's not-so-famous children. He was the city architect and planner in the post-war years. He saw Birmingham as a blank canvas, and he saw the post-war years as his mission to redevelop the city. He was a fan of concrete and motor cars, and he built great big highways and great tall tower blocks. And he wasn't really a fan of heritage or people. He just saw them as things to get in the way of his vision. And as we go into a whole new redevelopment phase, his mentality of knock it down and start again still prevails. Because we're going through a redevelopment we've never seen the scale of since the post-war years. And our legacy still looks for the council to do much of this redevelopment. We're consumers of their vision rather than producers of our own city. But they're just making up for the housing market. Within this country, we need 250,000 homes a year to be built, and yet in most years, if we're lucky, we build 135,000. And half of those are built by just 10 companies. The fact of the matter is the housing market isn't going to work. It can't work because it's not in their strategic interests to make it work. One of the leading house builders in the country puts this in their annual statement. We have grown completion volumes in a disciplined way. They don't want to grow too quickly because it's not in their interests. But their interests often have unintended consequences, like the 1.8 million people living in the country on housing waiting lists, 120,000 children sleeping in insecure overnight accommodation. But the fact is, it's not just as simple as building more houses. The housing crisis we have is a complex mess. You can't just build your way out of it. And to some extent, that makes us feel powerless. The complexity feels difficult to deal with. We don't really know what to do. And when you add in the legacy of being built for by the big companies or the big public sector, it makes that powerlessness even harder to overcome. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to start asking questions, to start being curious. So that's what I did. I wanted to look at our city and to find out not where the big opportunities were, but where the small opportunities were. Where were the places we could do something different? And this is what I found. It's over 66 hectares of land owned by the city council that's completely empty. And what you can see from that is there's no big bits, really. There's nothing big and juicy that a developer can go on and build their houses and disappear on. So these bits of land are going to need new ways of working. The old profit model isn't going to work here. Models like WikiHouse, which is an open source platform, a digitally produced and digitally fabricated building system for houses, a system to radically lower the barriers to self-build, a system which means you can locally print your house round the corner and build it with your friends, just powered by tea and cake. And it's based on a community of architects, designers, builders, fabricators around the world who are each testing, tampering, changing, and making the model better, working towards a collective aim rather than individual profit. And I know this works because we built one on the back of our house. But individual houses aren't going to solve this crisis. We've got to start looking at the way that we build our communities too. Models like cooperative housing, mutually owned home ownerships, and community land trusts that are spreading across the country. Models of development which fundamentally bake in affordability into the model. And it's real affordability. Affordability linked to local earnings rather than inflated market prices. And Leeds are taking this one step further. Their people-powered homes revolution has raised over £350,000 from thousands of people across the city investing their own money into the benefit of building community-led housing, showing that it's not just the people who buy the houses and live in the houses that can benefit from it. And this idea of collective wealth, building housing, is nothing new, really. This totem stands in the shadow of one of the biggest commercial developments within the city. And it's probably walked past hundreds of times a day, with people actually not really knowing what it says on it or even really caring. But what this marks is a really important moment for the whole of the financial institutions across the world. Because this was the site of a former pub, where a group of working people got together and decided that they weren't going to stand for the current housing system. They wanted to put their money together to collectively buy land and build houses for each other. This was the start of the building society revolution, and it started here in Birmingham. This is an Enlightenment era idea that's maybe ready for a 21st century comeback. Because we're starting to forget this idea. At a peak, we had over 1,000 building societies in the country. Societies which used individuals' money, collected it together, and built housing for everyone. It's dwindled to just 44. So whereas in the 19th century we looked to the philanthropists and the industrialists to make up for the shortfall in the housing market, and in the 20th century we looked to the public sector to do this for us, I believe in the 21st century we can create a new sector, the citizen sector, that looks to basically redevelop the whole model, that puts mutuality and collective benefit ahead of individual benefit in the housing market. Birmingham is on the brink of a new dawn. And if we're going to get it right, it's going to take all of us to get involved this time. Thank you.